event of the SIGA seminar series. Founded in 2017, Center for Islam and Global Affairs at the ISU organizes seminars, workshops, and conferences to analyze global policies and relations impacting the development and progress of Muslim societies. Today, our first speaker in this series will be Hasan Kösebalaban. Hasan Kösebalaban is an associate professor at Istanbul Şehir University's Department of Political Science and International Relations. He received his BA from International Islamic University in Malaysia, his MA from International University of Japan, and his PhD from University of Utah. Professor Kösebalaban is an expert on Turkish foreign policy and published extensively in this field. His articles and reviews appeared in various academic journals, including Inside Turkey, World Affairs, Middle East Politics, International Journal of Middle East Studies. The books he published also include the Islam and Politics in Southeast Asia, which is published in Turkish. Also the Turkish Foreign Policy, Islam, Nationalism and Globalization. And he also co-edited a book, Religion and Politics in Saudi Arabia, which was elected as an outstanding academic book by Choice magazine in 2009. His talk will be followed by Professor Sami Aryan's comments. Then we will take the questions from the audience. Without further ado, please help me welcome Professor Kösebalaban to give his talk, The Strategic Objectives of Turkish Foreign Policy, Threats and Opportunities.
Thank you very much for the invitation. And this is my first time to be in this beautiful campus. I'm very positively influenced by the historical atmosphere of this campus. And hopefully for many years it will produce science and knowledge not only in Turkey but also in the area and in globally speaking. I'm very hopeful about this university and the campus. I'm invited here to talk about the strategic challenges and opportunities that's facing Turkey and Turkish foreign policy. And my dissertation, which I completed at the University of Utah, compares Turkey and Japan from the perspective of civilizational identity and how these two countries, Turkey and Japan, even though they are not related to each other, actually faced similar challenges and similar issues, and they managed to cope with those issues and challenges. Later, I took the Turkey part out of this dissertation and published it as a book. And I will actually, today, will give you a brief outline of this book and my theoretical orientation. And we'll try to bring it quite in an updated fashion quite to this day and today, what is going on, because the book completes its coverage in a way until the Arab Spring. And I added a brief paragraph about the Arab Spring, but the Arab Spring really changed Turkey's options and Turkey's surroundings, Turkish foreign policy. So we have to include the Arab Spring as well as part of the contextual changes that influence Turkish foreign policy. My theoretical orientation is outside of the, for those who are familiar with the theories of international relations, the main dominant theory is realism. And realism takes the states as one single block. So the state speaks with one voice. The state is like a solid entity, and you don't need to break into the state. You don't need to analyze the domestic politics, although some versions of realism go into domestic politics. But mainly the structural realism take these entities like states as like balls, you can say, or black boxes. That compete with each other for their security, for their power, and the size of the black boxes depend on the military power of those countries, of those states. And my theoretical orientation is in contrast to this view. And I think that the country's domestic politics, not only the domestic politics in terms of the power struggle domestically, but also the country's historical baggage, historical legacy. Identity is very important, and it influences the country's strategic options and limits a country's strategic options. You know, so because of history, because of the identity, because of the perceptions, the security perceptions, we are constrained in our thinking to pursue a certain kind of foreign policy. You know, so I think that's not only true for Turkey, but for all countries. That's a universal theory, mainly influenced by constructivism, and constructivism is a theory that takes identity seriously. But there is also the structural constructivist, which I disagree with, like Alexander Wendt, who believes that the state has an identity, but he's still using the state as a singular entity. Like Turkey has a Turkish identity, Turkish nation identity. I depart from this approach in the sense that there's not one single identity, one single national identity, but there are many different identities. Okay, identity in the plural sense. You know, domestic politics is a contestation, is a platform for this contestation to take place. For these identities challenge each other and conflict with each other, and the foreign policy emerges out of this contestation and conflict. Okay, so there's the brief theoretical outline. Not only there is one single, not only that there is no single identity, but identities, but those identities also compete with each other. Okay, so where do we get those identities then in Turkish politics? I mean, first we need to look at the historical background of those identities. Well, I take my research from the root of those contesting identities from the late Ottoman era. There's a famous article by Yusuf Akçura to discuss three ways of politics, right? So you are familiar with this article. And these three ways of politics, Ottomanism, Turkism, right? Turkish nationalism, you can interpret that way, and Islamism, right? So these are the ways of Ottoman Empire ideological responses to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. So in a sense, the Ottoman intellectual climate produced three ideological responses to its collapse. So they say, if we want to deal with our decline, we have to offer a solution, an ideological solution. And that first solution was the Ottomanism. The idea that all the citizens, all the subjects of the empire should be called citizens, and all of the citizens are equal. So there's so the millet system has been dissolved. In the place of the millet system, a new identity, the Ottomanism, was constructed. Well, it didn't sell, right? So because the non-Muslim populations continue to their struggle for independence and continue to separate themselves, separate their race from the Ottoman Empire. So the second option was Islamism. So if we are left with the Muslims only in this empire, we can solve our decline and disintegration with Islamism, right? So by offering them an identity, all of them, Arabs, Kurds, Turks, Circassians, the Chechens, everybody living, the migrants from the Balkans, the Bosnians, etc., can call themselves Muslims, and we can also extend this to overseas, and the notion of caliph, the caliphate became an important notion to unite all of these different ethnic but Muslim groups together, and we can call this the Islamic solution. Well, the last one was Turkish nationalism, because obviously the Muslims continued their independence ways and to seek independence. Arabs, Arab revolt, the Albanian revolt and independence, etc. So this notion also failed, right? So Now the last option, the last intellectual response was Turkish nationalism. And Turkish nationalism can be considered, and Yusuf criticizes this also in that article. And he said you cannot call everybody Turk who are living in the empire, because there are Turks outside of the empire. And he comes from that origin, right? So there are Turks outside of the empire in Azerbaijan, in Central Asia, in different Turkic territories. So you cannot forget them. So Turkish nationalism historically struggled with these two different versions, right? So one is the notion of everybody is a Turk who are calling themselves Turk, but they have to live in the homeland. The other notion is more universal or extraterritorial notion of Turkish nationalism, which is more ethnic-based, and so linking Turkey with the ethnic Turkic communities in Central Asia, in Caucasia, etc. So I think that's my theoretical approach. This legacy of this clash among these three notions of identities, three notions of solutions, responses, continued into the later stages. Okay, so there is no rupture in that sense. Many historians, as you are familiar, do not see the 1923 as a historical rupture in Turkish history, but rather a continuity between the Ottoman era and the Republic in terms of the perceptions, ideological baggages, and things like that. So that's my starting point, that the ideologies, or the identities, I start with identities, national identities that are contesting with each other domestically to shape foreign policy. That origin, that starting point is the last Ottoman era. So it continues from there. And this contestation influences Turkish forms. Okay, let me stop here and then put another outline, another theoretical outline. For every country, including Turkey, foreign policy of that country is influenced by factors, right? There are many factors that influence your foreign policy options. Okay, so I categorize these foreign policy options theoretically into two groups. Okay, one is the ideational informants. It's not ideological necessarily, but ideational. It comes from idea, the word idea, ideational informants. Okay, non-material, non-structural group of factors. The other factors are material factors. Okay, now Turkey. In terms of ideational informants, historical memory is part of the ideational informant. A big informant for Turkish foreign policy is history, both negatively and positively, depending on how. Depending on your ideology, you can see history negatively or positively. Sometimes it limits Turkey. Sometimes it provides opportunities for Turkey. History is important, right? So the notion that Turkey starts in 1923 has failed when the Cold War was over, as you know, because there are many people who said, okay, we are also descendants of the Ottoman Empire. The Bosnian War started, right, so in that climate. Then the Iraq War started in that climate. We said, okay, there's this notion of geographical and historical discontinuity failed. Okay, history continues to serve as an informant of foreign policy. Again, this background of identities. History also provides for Turkey a culture, a strategic culture of insecurity. Okay, a culture of insecurity that comes from history. Because in our history, we were an empire and we became smaller. Okay, there's a memory of disintegration. And in its last incarnation, there is this further dismemberment of what is Turkey by the Treaty of Sevr, okay, in 1920. So Turkey had to go into the history pages if that treaty was implemented. Okay, so Turkish nationalist struggle for independence, the İstiklal Savaşı, took place. Okay, and Sever couldn't be implemented. Turkey was established in its current borders. Hatay was added. But Misak-ı Milli couldn't be implemented, right? So there's a Misak-ı Milli. So there are some important parts that are outside of this Misak, this national oath, such as Aleppo, such as Mosul, right? So, and some other places, Kirkuk, Western Thrace, right? So there's this memory. What we call this Sever syndrome. Okay, Sever syndrome is the underlying notion that those people who caused this integration, okay, of Turkey, of Ottoman Empire first and then Turkey, continue their plots to further disintegrate country, territorially speaking, cause problems. So the Sever, memory of Sever, never forgotten. Okay? Sever syndrome. It is a part of Turkish psyche, Turkish nationalist psyche that continues to influence Turkish foreign policy to this day. Okay, you can add more items to this. Right? Okay, so there is an invention of sometimes history is what it took place, what took place. Sometimes history, maybe more often, is invented. Okay, for example, I usually don't watch TV. Okay, so when we have guests, and most important guests are your in-laws, right? So your father-in-law, and he enjoys these TV programs, right? Payitaht, Abdulhamid. Okay, so there was this. I was trying to do something else to the extent that I can, and I heard that Americans are doing something, and they are discussing something about the United States. Okay, to my best knowledge, United States, politically speaking, was not a factor during those times. It was more Britain, Germany, France, etc. United States was involved in the Middle East through schools, hospitals, etc. But not politically speaking, because it was busy with something else called Monroe Doctrine, right? To implement the Monroe Doctrine, that's the protection of Western Hemisphere from Western interferences, etc. So that continued to be the United States position until the First World War. Before the First World War, United States in the Middle East was mainly was an active force, but not politically speaking, but rather culturally and educationally, etc. Missionaries, mainly the Boston Board of Missionaries, opened about 600 schools in the Ottoman territory, and they were received friendly by the Ottoman policy. And the reason why they were received friendly, Ottoman Empire encouraged opening of those Protestant missionary schools to convert Armenian Orthodox kids to Protestant Christianity. Because if they were converted into Protestant Christianity, they would escape, mentally speaking, from the control of Russia. Right. So big item was Russia in the minds of the Ottoman policymakers, not the United States. Even to the extent that the Syrian parliament, when it was the issue of mandate, decided that that it doesn't want mandate. The League of Nations imposed mandates in the Middle East. The Syrian National Parliament said no. But if mandate was a necessity, we would accept American mandate, and the second option was the British mandate, but never the French mandate. So the image of the United States in the region overall was not so negative, because the United States was not politically present in the region. That would come much later. Okay? But you are trying to infiltrate into the history, because now it is a good time to do that, right? So now, suddenly the history is reinvented. Okay? So history can be invented and reinvented. History can be constructed and deconstructed and reconstructed. Identities can be deconstructed, reconstructed as well, right? So identities are not static entities. Identities are always transforming themselves, right? So, as you can see, those three identities never existed as static. Those three identities I mentioned at the beginning, what are they? Ottomanism. Ottomanism, the current form of Ottomanism can be translated as liberal notion of citizenship. Liberalism transformed. Islamism transformed, and perhaps branched into many different branches, right? Turkish nationalism transformed and also branched into many different branches. This is quite natural and possible, right? And today we are seeing and witnessing further evolution of those ideologies. Maybe tomorrow we will speak about different ideologies, different identities. Okay, so this is the cultural or ideational context of foreign policy. The second notion of foreign policy is the structural material context of foreign policy. What we see here as factors that belong to the structural material context, population, very important. Okay, a country's foreign policy is subject to its population. You cannot have a big ambition, kind of ambitious foreign policy if you are a small country. And Singapore had a very charismatic prime minister, Lee Kuan Yew, very charismatic and very ambitious, but he can only be charismatic, and he could be and only charismatic and ambitious to the extent that his country's limits allowed him to be. So you can only be ambitious to the extent that your country's limits allow, and population is a certain factor in that limitation. Okay? And Turkey, specifically we are discussing Turkey, is a country whose population is coming to 100 million limit. And there are some philosophers of international relations who say that it's not possible to play a big power kind of foreign policy if you do not exceed 100 million in terms of population. Okay, so there's like why it is important, because you recruit troops also, the soldiers from that population. If you are an aging population, then you can have a foreign policy depending on that. But that's not enough. Population is not enough, because there are many countries with very big populations, and they cannot be, or they cannot play a big power foreign policy. You also need to be ambitious. Okay? Not only that you should have sufficient resources to be ambitious, but you also need to be ambitious. So that brings us to the first context, which is identity. And Turkish history provides ambitions. Right? So these ambitions for Turkey is provided by its history. Okay? Therefore, it's very important. But you can have your ambitions to the extent that your structural material limits allow you to materialize on those ambitions, right? So economy is certainly one of those limitations. By economy, I mean also the physical nature of Turkish economy, Turkish raw materials. Okay, so Turkey is an energy-dependent country. It depends on imports for its energy. Okay, so the energy is provided through imports. That's very important for foreign policy, because if you are like that, you cannot risk your relations with those countries that provide you energy. Okay? And in order to buy energy, in order to, like Japan, other comparative case was Japan, was in a similar notion. So what the Japanese did, after the major restoration, Japan became an industrialized country. They lost their self-sufficiency. So they had to import energy from outside. So you need to find some resource to buy that energy, and that resource, that capability is provided by exports. So you have to be an exporting country. You have to have money to buy imports. So if the two things do not balance each other, then you have deficit, right? So deficit the trade deficit can be sometimes offset through or eased through other sources of money, capital investments, direct capital investments, or tourism, even though you are not selling anything, but money is still coming. Okay, so that's very important as well for foreign policy. That, you know, all of these things are actually limits, limitations, constraints. Okay, on your ambitions. You can only stand from the place that you are sitting. Okay, that's you know. So even if you want to stand up, that's your physical constraint. Geopolitical location of the country. And this semester I'm teaching a course for American foreign policy. For the United States, the same kind of constraints and opportunities and limitations, etc. The same group of opportunities and limitations. They have to control two oceans. It's a vast task. Huge expenditure for Navy, right? Now they have to balance between East and the West. You know, I mean, are we playing a big game politics in the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific Ocean? They could do that before. Now they are increasingly unable to do that. So they have to ease in some place and concentrate on the other. And right now, the Trump thinking that, you know, they have to focus on the Pacific Ocean more. So for Turkey, geography is very important. Yes, our geography is different from the United States geography, but we are still talking about geography, right? So geography, the fact of the geography is that you are neighboring one giant power, Russia. Okay, so that's a fact. And Russia has also ambitions. So we cannot accuse Russians of having ambitions. You are ambitious, they are also ambitious. And these cannot be changed, right? These, your neighbors cannot change. You also neighbor Iran, which is equally ambitious, right? And trying to expand its sphere of influence. They also have a giant history that provide them ambitions and etc. Yes, military power is important then. You are surrounded by countries that are equally ambitious, and those ambitions are contradictory with yourself, with your own motivations, with your own strategic goals. Okay, so therefore military power is very important. Either to protect yourself, because the Russians have this historical ambition of coming to warm seas. They have different routes. Every country on those routes are also concerned about the same thing. It's not only Turkey which is concerned about Russia historically, but Japan, Central Asia, China, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Germany, Poland. Before Germany, there's Poland. Okay, so Central Asian, Central European countries, Eastern European countries. You know, so they also have to think of the same parameters of geography, or similar parameters of geography. For Turkey, Russia was the historical factor for disintegration, imperial disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, and Russian ambitions continued, or perceived to, I mean, I'm not expressing a fact here, but also the perceptions. So it was perceived among the Turkish policymakers in such way that they see these territorial ambitions of Russians to expand into Turkey. Factually or not, doesn't matter. Because unless a fact is transformed into perception, that's not a fact. You have to see that as a fact for the fact to exist. Okay? So you can transform your image of Russia also. If that can translate into fact, I don't know. That's quite a risk also, right? I mean, there is this notion that constructivists usually see that the facts can be deconstructed, yes, to some extent, yes. Like this Matrix movie, you know, there's this boy who goes to see an oracle. Have you seen the first of the Matrix movies? There's a spoon, the spoon bends, in the waiting room when the boy plays with the spoon, spoon bends. But Neo, there's the character Neo, have the same spoon, the spoon doesn't bend. And the boy says, it is in your mind. If you want to make the spoon bend, you have to change your perception of the spoon as a physical object. The realist response to this is that if I throw you the spoon, see if it is painful or not. You have to see, so yes, facts cannot be reimagined outside of a certain limit. You have to make a balance here. Facts cannot be deconstructed, limitless way, right? So there's a limit. And the Russian threat was the limit, okay? They were not joking. They basically defeated the Ottoman Empire year after year after year. They were the protectorate over the Orthodox populations of the Ottoman Empire. They encouraged their independence. The Ottoman elite that also served as the Turkish elite, one of the actual big continuity in Turkey is that the elite of the Ottoman Empire is the same elite of the Ottoman Empire, even in terms of families. Okay, so they carried this memory that they have lost an empire, particularly the military schools, provided the channel to transmit this memory. Okay, so that's very important, the military class of the Ottoman Empire. The first idea of reform in the Ottoman Empire started at the military schools, not among the ulama, or the scholarly community, or the universities, or the, let's say, political scientists, or something like that, if they existed at all. It was the military. Why do you think that's the case? Because the military is the one who witnessed two things, victory or defeat. But in the last years of the Ottoman Empire, they only witnessed one thing, defeat. Another type of schools that the idea of reform grew was the military medical school. Because the military medical doctors, but those medical doctors have ranks. They are lieutenants or colonels, but they are also, they serve in the battlefield. They also witnessed the life and death, two things, life and death. You can even, you can see two things, not in between. Okay? So this wasn't visible to most people living outside of the battlefield. So their motivation, their goal, their eagerness to reform was stronger than other groups. So they're like a flag carrier of the reform idea, but they got their training from the positivist philosophy and background. So they had to implement these reform ideas in a way that the positivism guided their ways of implementing. This is a long story, but what I want to say is that this memory of Ottoman defeat, this memory of Syria, in a way carried over into later stages and shaped Turkish foreign policy choices. So what the Ottoman Empire did then? The Ottoman Empire sought allies in the West. France and Britain were willing to serve as allies to the Ottoman Empire. When the Ottoman Empire lost a battle against Russia, France and Britain were always ready to negate the gains against Russia. The Russians were very angry because they couldn't get from the table, negotiating table, enough gains in comparison to their military victories. And this was because of the European interference. Later, they decided not to play the game, the Eastern question. They moved closer to Russia because another power was rising in Europe, Germany. So three of them now joined their hands at the expense of the Ottoman Empire, Britain, France, Russia. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, Constantinople Agreement. Constantinople Agreement is the one that Britain promises Constantinople, the Straits, and the Dardanelles to Russians. And Russians signed this. This agreement is a fact. which became, we came to know about this agreement after the Russian Revolution. Okay? So Germany was the more available ally for the Ottoman Empire. Not because Ottoman elites loved Germany, but Germany was the only ally that could provide this balancing factor against, again, Russia. Well, the Sultan Abdülhamid noticed that a new power defeated Russia in 1905, Japan. He sent a ship to Japan to investigate if it is possible to make an alliance. But Japanese defeated Russia with a small power. It wasn't enough. And the geography is too limiting for both countries to make an alliance. And Japanese, by the way, were not interested in this alliance because they needed alliance with Britain. And Japan won the war against Russia because it was an ally of Britain. So they didn't want to say, I mean, this was a secret, this Arturo ship was a secret mission. The Japanese wanted that way because the alliance with Britain was very important for them. So the Germany was the only one. Now after the Republic, Soviet Union provided little bit help for Turkey, financial help as well during the War of Independence against Britain and French, etc. But you know, I don't want to make this a long discussion of the single party era, but there were mainly three groups within the CHP of Atatürk era. The İş Bankası group, the Celal Bayar group, they were closer to Britain. The second group was the Recep Peker group, they were close to Germany, Italy, their idea of fascist government. But the third group, the Kadro group, okay, they were not institutional part of CHP because Atatürk wanted them to be away from CHP. But he also courted them. He delegated the ideological mission of CHP to them, but then didn't bring them because the other two groups also didn't want them, you know. So Aydemir and Kara Osmanoğlu and many others. Okay, so they studied in Moscow. So even during this time when Turkish-Soviet relations were very close, CHP didn't want those people to be inside CHP. So stay away. If we need you, we will call you. But don't go too far. But just stay in the neighborhood. So we will call you if we need you. But they were not made part of the CHP establishment. During the time of İnönü's neutrality, Second World War, why Turkey was neutral? It was because Turkey couldn't guess which side Russia would be allied to, and if that side would be winning. So Turkey always courted the position of Russia. If Russians were moving closer to Germany, Turkey moved closer to the British side. Okay, so this maneuvering caused a delay in Turkish decision. So the Russia was still a factor in the Turkish decision of staying neutral during the time of the Second World War. During this time as well, Turkish foreign policy establishment secretly negotiated with Germany in the case that Germany emerges victorious, we would form a Turkestan in Central Asia. So they were not necessarily isolationist people. They were also very ambitious, but they wanted to implement. I mean, it was very carefully orchestrated kind of stage. Well, Second World War took place. The United States interfered on behalf of the European alliance, and the new world order was created. Cold War started. Turkish strategic imperative became also the balancing against the Soviet Union. And at that time, NATO membership became the institutional umbrella for this alliance. So the NATO membership, unlike it is portrayed in some of the recent reinvention of the history, is not an imposition on Turkey. Turkey willingly joined NATO, sacrificed to join NATO. this is quite an important fact. I mean, serving the honesty of being an academic on foreign policy, we have to give this credit that NATO was a Turkish initiative. I mean, the Turkish membership in NATO was not something that they imposed on Turkey to force Turkey, but rather Turkish side wanted to join. And the cost of that was to send troops to Korea. Well, coming after the post-Cold War era, the solution of the Soviet Union provided for Turkey an opening to infiltrate into the Soviet sphere of influence, former Soviet sphere of influence. Russia was a very weak power. United States encouraged Turkey also to go into Central Asia. That's the Özal time. The ECO was expanded. Demirel said, now you have the Turkish age. That's not Özal, but Demirel said from the Adriatic Sea to China Wall. That was quite an unnecessary statement because that alerted many other powers. Okay, not only Russians, but also the Chinese. Because Turkey's sphere of influence does not end in Central Asia, it expands into China. Right? So, and that alerted many people. Okay, so then the resurgence of Russia, that Turkish idea of creating this new Turkish sphere of influence failed because Russia became stronger. Turkey gave up its supporting policy to the Chechens, gave up Chechnya basically to Russia, and then we came to 2002. Let's say fast forward to 2002. A new party came to power in Turkey, and it declared its objective. A new Islamism was invented, right? It's pro-EU Islamism. Well, that's not a contradiction because the AKP elites, the AK Party elites, defined Europe in different terminology. They say this is not a clash of civilizations, but meeting of civilizations. We are still Muslims and we are a civilization. We will come to Europe, join the Europe, but we will be, joining the Europe with our own civilization, with our own civilizational pride. Okay. Well, then the European resistance to this idea caused kind of Euro fatigue, European tiredness. Okay, so because at that time, and I have the statistics, 65% of Turkish population supported the EU membership. The highest support was among the AKP voters, more than the CHP voters. And my first academic article actually investigates the roots of Kemalist opposition to the EU membership, which I published when I was a student, a PhD student. Why does Kemalists do not want to join the EU? And I said this is because of Sevr syndrome, etc. So the EU membership, the eagerness, the motivation was higher among the Islamists than among the secularists in Turkey. Well, 2011, something happened in the Middle East. Quite an unexpected thing. Perhaps could spark kind of change in the Middle East. That's the revolt that's starting from Tunisia, the revolt for democracy, the Arab Spring. And Turkey says, this could be good for me. This could, enhance my objectives. I'm sorry, I forgot one thing. That's 2003 Iraq War. That's very important, but I apologize. Two incidents. You can also add the Arab Spring to this, but 2003 is the first one. The second is the Arab Spring. Two developments, two incidents, two happenings really changed Turkey's strategic parameters in the Middle East. Has to look towards the Middle East. 2003 Iraq War basically changed the strategic balance in the Middle East against Turkey. Why? Because Iraq, under Sunni control, was blocking Iran's access to the Mediterranean Sea. When Iraq became Shia regime, I'm not saying this to, and if I reflect these feelings, it is not intended. Okay, this is like an objective analysis. This competition between Turkey and Iran is very ancient, as you know. I mean, even before the Turks arrived in our geography, still the powers that control Anatolia and the power that control Iran also competed over the same land. Okay, so Ottoman Empire, Safavid Empire, Turkey and Iran. Okay, so this is quite a natural competition of sphere of influence. Now, 2003 Iraq War changed this to the advantage of Iran because it gave Iraq to Iran. Basically, you know, they say in the United States, to Bush, to President Bush, you gave Iraq on a golden plate to Iran. Suddenly, an Iranian man in Iraq, an Iranian man, Ayatollah Sistani, a Persian, he's a Persian, who was in Iraq because of disagreement with Khomeini, became the most important man in Iraq. Of course, nowadays the situation is still the same, but even more to the side of Iran. I mean, because Iran militarily also controls the region. So Turkey had to respond to this. The first initial response of Turkey was to develop relations with the Kurds in Iraq. I mean, we developed our relations with Iraq. I mean, Iraqi Kurds, the Barzani, etc. So Barzani was a very good man in Turkey. Up until very recently, he was a very good man. So, at the expense of Iraqi territorial integrity, because you cannot have a relationship with, let's say, with California. That's against the U.S. Constitution, because treaties in the United States can only be signed with the United States. I mean, if Turkey can sign a treaty with the United States, not with California. California do not have that jurisdiction. But if you sign a treaty with Iraqi Kurdistan, that you are recognizing the Kurdistan's independence. It's against the territorial integrity. So this is what all of the way, all the way Turkey was supporting territorial autonomy and independence of Iraqi Kurdish territory at the expense of Iraqi territorial integrity. Why? Because of the competition with Iran. Because other than the Kurdish territory, all of Iraq was very much in the hands of the Iranians. Now, with Iraq, Iran completed its access to the sea, because Iran, Iraq, Syria, and even though we don't have the border with Lebanon, but Lebanon should also be considered in that way, the Hezbollah and Hezbollah-influenced government. So Turkey then, in 2011, saw this an opportunity. Okay? Now I can break the chain at its weakest ring. What is the weakest ring? Demographically speaking, it's Syria. Because in Syria, close to 80% of the population is Sunni. Okay, I understand that 75%, whatever the population, I mean, it's not 75%, but what is the 65%, right? The Shia population in Iraq.
55, 60.
65, yeah. Okay, we understand that if they want to be democracy, then they have to be Shia controlled. Democracy, right? You want democracy, but why not in Syria? If Syria, do the same thing, give them democracy as well, you will see the result in Syria. Your influence is not fair. Because if you want democracy in Iraq, you should also want democracy in Syria. Turkish perspective was, right? So, because that would break the chain, strategically speaking. Now, of course, rhetorically speaking, it was all about human rights and etc. But strategically speaking, Turkey had to break the chain. Otherwise, you do not have access to the rest of the Middle East if Iran doesn't allow Turkey. And there was the slowing down of the tracks, etc. Now, of course, the Arab Spring also caused resentment and strain in relations between Turkey and Egypt. Well, your sea access is also gone, in a way. Okay, even though they cannot, because of international treaty, They cannot prevent Turkish ships from crossing the Suez Canal, but they can slow them down. Slowing them down is very easy to do, bureaucratic hurdles, right? 2 days of shipping delay is a lot of money. And some of these are time-sensitive products. Okay? So Arab Spring provided first an opportunity, but the failure of Arab Spring caused a lot of trouble for Turkey. And the United States is the primary responsible actor for Turkey, because United States, Obama, encouragement from Obama for the Arab Spring, or Turkey interpreted that way. Obama's speech in Cairo was very revolutionary. Basically, he said, if you want change, we will give you change. We will not, and he did that. He basically met his promise of Cairo speech by not blocking the Tahrir revolution. But later, when the coup took place, United States and Obama basically sidelined. Strategically, perhaps they had to do that, because which country do you think Sisi and his team visited most? United States or Moscow? Moscow. I mean, Syria, the Russian interference in Syria, and the Russian massing of troops, military power in Syria, and also Crimea in the north of the Black Sea. You are almost, as Turkey, squished. What was the name of that tool? Mengene. You know, those two sides of Mengene, from the Black Sea to the Syria by Russia, inside that Mengene, Turkey. So that's my reading of the situation. Now, what Turkey could do, if the United States is not willing to help, but rather the United States is now helping not Turkey but to PYD, and PYD is institutionally connected to the PKK, and that's not a secret. Turkey moved closer to the side of Russia. There's also a change of government, as you know. I don't want to go into detail about this. So the strategic imperatives of Turkey changed from overthrowing of Assad regime to prevention of a Kurdish state in Syria. And Russia seemed to agree with this. The United States does not seem to agree. It doesn't say, you know, we will create a Kurdish state, but it is moving towards that direction. And also you have to put in that context that the United States does not want or refuses to extradite, right? So Fethullah Gülen, the leader of the coup in July 15. There's the ongoing case against Turkish interest and state. So the United States is not a willing ally to protect Turkey from anybody, but rather causes a strategic problem and turmoil in Turkish territory. So Turkey, as of now, is moving closer and closer to the side of Russia. My question, and we discussed this also a little bit before, is this sustainable? Is this sustainable in the long run, that Turkey becomes an ally of Russia, reversal of NATO membership, or the strategic imperative? Now, the enemy is the United States or Europe, Germany, and Russia is the factor to balance against them. Okay, as of now, we see a situation like that. And my argument is that in the long run, this is not a sustainable position. Why? Because it is against the two factors that I started with. Two set of factors. That's the cultural factor, set of context, identity, history, historical memory. The other is the material factors. So those factors, two sets of factors, causes a reality for Turkey that cannot be deconstructed, that Russia cannot serve as a reliable strategic ally for Turkey to balance against anybody. Why? I will give you one example. If we are angry for the United States to support PYD, Russians do this exactly the same thing. Not only that, Russia is the only country in this equation, in this calculation, not to recognize PKK as a terrorist organization, gives diplomatic recognition to the PKK. You can say that, of course, others are more hypocritical. Russians are more clear, you know, and straightforward. Should we appreciate that and still, shake hands? Because Europeans, you know, even though they don't give this diplomatic recognition, they support all the way the PKK, right, in Europe. Yes, that's true. But if NATO members also recognize PKK the same way as Russia does, it will create a tremendous pressure on Turkey, diplomatically speaking, that Turkey cannot possibly overcome. So diplomatic recognition is still a very important stage. And only Russians do that. So your strategic partner, in a way, is the one that not only gives support to PKK, but also recognizes it and hosts PKK in the form of an embassy. PKK and PYD have an office in Moscow. And during these talks and discussions, they made this very clear. They made this very clear that they are not interested in changing this position. Okay, so therefore I do not think that balancing against the United States or Europe is possible through Russia. You have to find either a new ally to balance against them, or go to another route, which may be self-sufficiency in Turkish military security needs. That is a very long way and risky. As I said, the limits that come from Turkish economy and imperatives are not the same as Iran. Iran can be self-sufficient because they have to export oil, and oil nobody can block Iranian oil. Because if you block Iranian oil, I mean the embargo against Iran is not about oil, but only not to give them cash. Right? You can buy their oil, but you cannot give them cash. That's the American embargo, right? Against Iran. But they don't say don't buy their oil, because if you don't buy oil, the prices will skyrocket. And nobody can tolerate that. And the United States strategic imperative is to keep the oil price low on purpose. Right? Because of squeezing Russia. Russian economy is in very bad shape. Another reason is perhaps for Turkey is this, and I have this number, that Turkey has to be, as I said, Turkey has to be a trading nation. And just let me conclude with this. Turkish exports, to buy the imports, very important. Turkish exports, this is 2016 numbers, because the 2017 is not complete, so we don't have the numbers. In 2016, Turkey exported to Germany $14 billion, to United Kingdom $11.7 billion, Iraq $7.64 billion, and much of that is unfortunately risky right now. As you know, the Kurdish region is the one that is consuming, these exports. Italy 7.5, United States 6.62. Russia is not among them. It's not among the top export markets of Turkey. Top import origins, imports. Germany $24 billion, China $16 billion, Russia $13 billion, Italy $10.6 billion, United States $9.4 billion. We import from Russia, but we cannot sell to them. And it is not because they don't want to buy tomato. That's not an issue. Because to Germany, what we sell are industrial products. That is labor intensive inside Turkey. I mean, if we cannot sell these products to Germany, and many of these actually their own companies' products, investments inside Turkey, such as a Mercedes truck factory, etc. If we cannot sell, there will be also a problem in Turkish economy, because tomato is not a labor-intensive product, but car is. And many of these cars are resold to European markets. Even looking at these figures will tell you that the relationship between Turkey and Europe NATO, basically, zone, and the United States. Not because of the export figures, but because of the technology and everything, is very strategic. You cannot really sacrifice from this. I mean, what Russia offers to Turkey, other than S-400, yeah, and gas, in terms of technology, in terms of capital investment, in terms of buying back your products, is close to zero. They want to sell, but they don't want to buy. And they cannot buy, possibly speaking. There's a mismatch in the economic concentration. You know, I mean, for two countries to trade with each other, you need to be complementary. Your economies need to be complementary. And here, you see a situation where the economies are not complementary. So I am quite skeptical. And my criticism about this is that Turkey lacks from a lack of, Turkey suffers from a lack of strategic orientation as of now. It is strategic objectives do not seem to be well defined and do not seem to fit the overall, the longevity of historical grand strategy of Turkey. Therefore, it might be necessary still. I'm not criticizing that, don't do that in that way. But even if you are doing that, the question is it sustainable? And my answer is unfortunately no, it is not sustainable, because it doesn't really suit the country's own strategic imperatives, the country's own limitations, economic limitations, and more importantly, the country's historically grounded, historically rooted ambitions. Because our ambitions contradict Russian ambitions in the Balkans, in the Middle East, when it comes to democracy and democratization of the region, in Ukraine, in Crimea, but more importantly, inside Russia. And changing the demographic population, demographic dynamics of Russia. I mean, you don't have to look at this sustainability question only from the perspective of Turkey. Even from the perspective of Russia, Turkey has a very special place in Russian strategic terminology, which is unfortunately not very positive. And that's my, kind of pessimistic, skeptical perhaps analysis. But nevertheless, I have to give that way for the frankness and honesty, sake. Thank you very much.
Now we will have Professor Aryan give his comments to Professor Kösebalaban.
Thank you, Dr. Hasan, for a very illuminating and great lecture describing the strategic situation of Turkey, the strategic objectives. I'm not going to repeat or summarize. I'll just raise some points for the sake of time. You set up the framework for understanding the strategic objectives of Turkey, especially with outlining at the end of the Ottoman and beginning of the Republican era into the current events, and how Turkey is trying to balance, if you will, domestically, and I think you pointed out the importance of domestic politics in its proper role in projecting and understanding foreign policy, and that's true for every country. The Ottomanism, Islamism, and nationalism, and the way they played, even though it's not clear to me, and perhaps you can elaborate, how that plays into the historical progress in Turkey when it comes to the dominant role that the military played in its historical progression, and how these strategic objectives were maintained, if we're assuming that these three identities were mixed, even though they do not show themselves within the military that has for a long time controlled the strategic position of Turkey. If I understand it correctly, if we want to identify, and this is basically from our perspective at the center, we're trying to understand what actually motivates Turkish foreign policy, what are the strategic objectives of Turkish foreign policy, as I understand it. And you may want to point out if there are more, that number one, Turkey is trying to defend against neighboring ambitious powers, primarily Russia and Iran. Historically, that was the case, at least from the 17th century onward. But also, U.S. as being a global power, especially after World War II. And if you understand America's strategic objectives in the world, one of the major strategic objectives of the U.S. is never to allow a Eurasian power to exist outside its sphere of influence and control. And at least from observing Turkish foreign policy for the past 15 years, we can see that there is a government that is trying actually to somehow assert itself in the area, in its military posture, in its military industry, trying to have an independent, relatively independent foreign policy and to exert influence outside, which is a threat to that strategic objective of the U.S. So I did not see much of that into the discussion. Do you think that is also a concern? Could that also be an impediment? Could that be also added to the mix? The other strategic, if you may, which is the idea of a strategic balance. And again, I'd like to elaborate a bit. Are we talking strategic balance also against Iran and Russia in the area? Is that how Turkey looks at this? Putting in mind that Turkey also had, obviously, a choice to make after the Arab Spring. And I'm not sure that they have seriously considered that. After the Arab Spring, there was a revolutionary force, or a revolutionary potential force, and counter-revolutionaries. And indeed, the counter-revolutionaries won the day. But Turkey could have actually allied itself with the with the revolutionary forces and give them real support in order to resist. That did not happen. And I know that not as speculation or analysis, but factually speaking. Yes, they gave home to many oppositions, they helped them here and there, but there wasn't really a strategic support for the revolutionary forces. Whether that is by design or this is because of the domestic, you mentioned, the effect of domestic policies and domestic situation on foreign policy, is something that you may want to elaborate on. The third strategic objective that I see it, which is limiting the potential of Turkey, is its internal fault line, which throughout the Ottoman Empire, you mentioned very eloquently the fact that they tried to maintain the empire first through the non-Muslims. That failed through Ottomanism, their citizenship. Then they tried to maintain at least the Muslim populations, especially the Arab states, through Islamism. That failed. And then they had to hold into nationalism, but that also was a problem because you have two major ethnicities, Turks and Kurds. And so from my understanding is that this is a huge fault line, and also strategic thinkers especially in the US, but in the West, generally speaking, they always try to use that, these major fault lines, whether in ethnicity or religious strife, in order to weaken it. So how does the Turkish decision maker going to again, I'm talking about from a strategic point of view, how are they going to overcome this? Because obviously you see things which are contradicting. On one hand, they want to check Iran's influence. On the other hand, so they have a relationship with Barzani, and at the same time, they're trying to prevent having, obviously, a similar situation in Turkey. These are, seem to be contradicting. Finally, I have too many points, but because of the lack of time, and I want also the others to participate, I wanted to comment on this notion of quote-unquote Islamist-oriented government, and whether this government actually has that into their strategic calculation, or is it just aspiring to become some sort of an Islamic ideal or model? And how does that factor into the fact that you have history, again, the historical and cultural notions or informants, as you call them, versus the potential of being the model where they can actually rally, because obviously the whole area now, in the post-Arab revolution, in the post-Arab Spring, they're looking for a leader, somebody who can actually show a model and move forward. But having seen that Turkey is basically so occupied with its internal interest, people are not sure how to understand this foreign policy. So strategically speaking, is there an underlying factor where it says Turkey actually could look into the greater interest of the area at the expense probably of small short-term gains, or is it the short-term gains will always win over this thing? In other words, if I have to look at the decision maker in Turkey of them taking certain positions and decisions and policies that may affect Turkey in the short term, but in the long term it would be in the overall progress of Muslim societies around us. And Syria obviously was a very telling example, and you put it very, I think you hit it on the point about why they did what they did, and now they're tracking back. So these are some of the points that I would like to get your reaction, and you may want to open it later.
Yes.
You want to add or no?
No,
Okay. Now this is very insightful and difficult, hard questions. Not only to myself as an analyst, but to Turkish foreign policy. I mean, Turkish foreign policy struggles with these difficulties, contradictions. For example, the idea of democratization. Yes, it will enhance Turkey's sphere of influence in the region. Turkey as a democratic model, but at the same time, the security imperatives and the security paradigm in which Turkey has entered creates so many contradictions between democracy and security. So the continuing state of emergency, for example, etc. You know, so or the contradiction between supporting the overthrow of Assad regime for democracy or for Islamism, and at the same time, these will empower the Kurds, and we knew that from the very beginning, that the collapse of Assad will create a situation in which the Kurds will be empowered, and the Turkish nationalism, the resurgence of Turkish nationalism, has difficulty to come into terms with this new reality. And all of these, in some ways, these contradictions are historical contradictions. These are not new contradictions, and these identity contradictions. And I mean, many people actually, after the collapse of Davutoğlu government, expected the return of a rational foreign policy, right? So there were many writings and many messages sent on social media that now we are trying. Now Turkey is returning to a realistic foreign policy that will protect its own realistic interest. Well, for me, as a constructivist, the modified constructivist, there is no rational foreign policy. Every foreign policy is based on a security culture or a culture of insecurity. So you give up democratic idealism of Davutoğlu, you embrace a nationalist foreign policy. You are not trying. I mean, you are not. It's not possible to escape from identity. One identity puts contradictions and constraints, and it also provides opportunities. But the other identity is also very deficient. It also has contradictions. It's also very difficult. I mean, I'm a Turk. I'm not. I'm ethnically speaking. I'm part of the Turkish side of Turkish population. I come from a very nationalistic background also in my family and in many. But I really do not see that Turkey's current position on Kurds is sustainable. There's a democratic fact out there, and you have to come into terms with this democratic fact. United States will one day pack and go home. But you are to stay here. If you are willing to pack and go home, which is there's no home other than this country for us, we have to make peace with our own reality. But that is a very difficult struggle to come to terms with the reality, because so many years of influence of identity. I mean, again, Sever syndrome, the syndrome of disintegration. What if they want their independence and go for their independence, then we lose this country? That's the last country. We don't have any other empire or another country other than this land or something. So all of these notions. By the way, I did not present this. I mean, some people present that way, but I do not see that Ottomanism, Islamism, and nationalism are three separate identities. It exists in the mindset of everybody who are in this country, in some ways, in different degrees. Like Atatürk, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. Was he a secularist? Yes. Was he a nationalist? Yes. Was he an Islamist? Question mark. You will say no, he wasn't an Islamist. But I will say he was an Islamist par excellence. Why? Because of the agreements he signed, the population exchange agreement, he gave the Turkish-speaking Orthodox Christians from this land and took from Greece non-Turkish speaking Muslims. The agreement does not refer to their being Turkish. Turkish nationalism has a very strong Islam in it. Whether one is secular or not, whether one is practicing Muslim or not, Turkish nationalism or Turkish nationalists are also very much Islamist in that sense. But Islamists themselves, are they Islamists in the sense of imagining an ummah in which an Indonesian can be an Khalif? No, Turkish Islamists do not imagine an ummah. They imagine their own leadership. They imagine their own ummah. In which only a Turkish Caliph is acceptable. Is it not true? Yes, it is true. So Turkish Islamists are also very much nationalist. The Ottomanists are also very much nationalist. They use an Islamic vocabulary to express a very much a nationalist idea of a homeland. So these identities show their presence at different times. Now, for example, it is time for nationalism to show itself. Islamism becomes out of fashion, right? But it's still there. It is still there, even in the minds of the secularists, I would say. Okay, this is at least how I perceive. It's a very difficult case because you cannot separate these identities also from each other. The military has exerted an influence on Turkey, on Turkish foreign policy in historical stages. Unfortunately, many of these were not very positive because it came after the military coups, and Turkey gave its biggest concessions after military coups, such as the acceptance of Greece to NATO. And therefore, I said, in one of my messages on social media, yes, you can leave NATO, but think that you cannot come back. If you want to come back, you cannot come back. You know why? Because Greece will veto. They will revenge. Because Turkish civilian governments didn't allow Greece to return, and after 1980 coup, they were allowed to return. Why? Because Turkey wanted concessions from the West about European integration. So, yes, those influences from the military were not very positive, but what I want to say, the civilians always fighting their war at the domestic field against the military or militarization, the civilian leadership, they also followed a foreign policy to empower the civilian side of Turkish politics. A foreign policy that would, for example, create linkages with institutions. Empowerment of civilian sector of Turkish population. European integration was very good for the civilian politicians because European integration empowers the civilian side of Turkish politics, not the military side of Turkish politics. Therefore, and again, please note this, Turkey's agreements with the European integration, important agreements, milestones in the European integration, were all signed by liberal right-wing governments. Or started liberal right-wing governments. And the most important milestones were achieved during the time of this government. which is the full recognition of full membership process. And so why they wanted this, to give up the important part of their sovereignty, is because they are fighting an internal war against the military or institutionalized Turkish nationalism, represented by the military. They wanted some kind of support from the Western institutions to empower the Turk. I mean, this is a big fight. The Sheriff Mardin, puts this way. This is a fight in Turkish politics between the center and the periphery. And the center and periphery fight still continues. But the periphery thinks that it became center. In my opinion, the periphery thinks that it became the center too early. Okay, I will finish this way. Too early. Okay, so it has important repercussions. So don't think that you became the center too early, because the center is still very powerful culturally, intellectually, institutionally. Okay, so this is how I see
the issue of Islam. Turkey's role in Muslim world.
I mean, Islamism, the influence of Islamism, this is being criticized right now because the media pundits, I call them pundits, and this is what they are called also in different countries. Those people who think that, they are experts of everything. Right now, you have a TV program. The TV program talks about agriculture. The same group of people discuss the agriculture, and after that they talk about the issue of the meat prices. The same group people discusses this, and then they shift to NATO. The same group of people discusses this. So these people are pundits. So now Islamism is attacked by these pundits. I mean, now that I said, therefore, Islamism is out of fashion. Islamists are under attack. Okay. How I see it is, there is no rationalization of Turkish foreign policy at any era. You are always subject to the influence of identity. And Islamism provides a good opportunity, because the title of this speech is Opportunities and Challenges, in a way. Like, did you put that title? Yeah. Islamism provides opportunities for Turkey, but Islamism may also provide some challenges. If you cannot separate between the rational interest and ideological inputs in your mind. For example, I said this already, I will not hesitate saying this again. Egypt. Yes, our hearts are burning with the problem in Egypt, the coup and everything. But at the same time, two countries need to maintain their relationship. From our perspective, it is very important that Turkish trade with Asia is not prevented because of problem in Egypt. So, yes, to some extent, we are very much concerned about what is going on in a country like Egypt or another country. But to another extent, Turkish state's correspondence in Egypt is another state, not the opposition. If that state is represented by Mursi, that's very good. But if that state is represented by Sisi, that is bad for me individually, but for the state, that relationship has to continue. I mean, I'm very pragmatic about this. I mean, I see this as a pragmatic. Therefore, I said, from the perspective of the United States, if they did not follow this strategic imperative, Egypt would be closer to Russia. And now Turkey is also very close to Russia, but at that time, Turkey didn't want that. And I don't think, strategically speaking, from the interest perspective of Turkey, if Egypt moves closer to Russia, to Putin's side, it will be good for Turkey. So I am trying to separate here between the influence of Islamism. It should not be allowed to contradict with the interest of the state. So to the extent that we are capable of managing that, that will be good for Turkey. But to the extent that Islamism, ideological input is dominant and basically prevent the materialization of your national interest, it may, create a problem. And therefore, after the next stage of normalization of Turkish relations with Assad, there will be a possible normalization of relations with Egypt. Because this cannot be sustained. Egypt is let me put this very frankly. As a Turk, I'm saying this. Geostrategically speaking, Egypt is more important than Turkey. We have to accept this. I mean, their location in that land is very, very important for Turkey. So you have to. I think Turkish government knows this. Therefore I cannot talk on their behalf or against them. That they have to normalize this relationship. But so Islamism, in a way, is good. It creates opportunities, but from a certain extent, it may create actual strategic difficulties.
Thank you. We will take 3 questions from the audience. We have only 5 minutes, or maybe we can extend it to 10, but only 3 questions. Erhan Hoca.
I just would like to add 2 brief things, and then I'm going to ask a question. One thing, if I'm not wrong, Egypt, I'm a lecturer in the Department of Political Science and International Relations. My name is Erhan. The first one, if I'm not wrong, Egypt actually was the country that was receiving the highest foreign aid from the United States for years. So this is also showing the importance of after Israel. Okay, forget about Israel. So this is in the pocket. The second thing, I just would like to highlight that when you talked about the trade relations between Turkey and the EU, you highlight the importance of that relationship. And also we should keep in mind that right now also Turkey and the EU is discussing upgrading of customs union agreement and to further developing and further integrating this relationship with the European Union. This is also a fact at the moment. My question is, I don't know whether you have seen it or not, just 3 hours ago, US Embassy Turkish Twitter account tweeted a part from the speech of Secretary of State Tillerson given in the Wilson Center. I just would like to read it and I would like to comment on that. Actually also the account translated the message into Turkish. So US Embassy translated the message in Turkish. He says, it's a long speech titled as US and Europe strengthening Western alliances. And in that speech he says, at Europe's intersection in the region, we know Turkey cannot ignore Iran because of geographic proximity and cultural ties. This is the part that they translated in Turkish. But we ask Turkey, as a NATO ally, to prioritize the common defense of its treaty allies. Iran and Russia cannot offer Turkish people the economic and political benefits that membership in the Western community of nations can provide. So they are highlighting that, and it doesn't say Turkish state, it says Turkish people. I think it's important. And Iran and Russia cannot be an alternative in that region. So how do you comment on this tweet message or?
Let's take 2 more questions.
Okay.
One Uwais and one from a student. Uwais, yeah.
My name is Uwais Khan. I'm a research assistant at SIGA. I really enjoyed your talk, but like Dr. Al-Aryan emphasized, one of the continuous thread was this question of Russia, right, and how its historical memory impacts Turkish foreign policy. The issue of rupture, right, like the creation of the Turkish state, as the way that your analysis works is that the rupture is no rupture, right? That there's a continuous kind of influences from the past. I wonder if we made more space for rupture, if that would change our analysis. For instance, Russia, right? The Russia that defeated the Ottoman Empire is its objectives, its imperial ambitions. They were, were they not transformed with 1917? Does that not come into a calculation to Turkish, foreign policy calculations? The idea of hegemony, right, like U.S. hegemony over the globe, like which was kind of ignored or was not emphasized in your talk, right? Russia's position vis-a-vis this hegemony it may be advantageous for Turkey in a certain sense. To imagine the Russia of today as being the same Russia that defeated the Ottoman Empire is a kind of mythical imagination, isn't it? And that like Turkey today is continuing some kind of Ottoman legacy or something like that, or fighting the wars of revenge in the 19th century. Even the fight against the Russians was very limited. It was, I mean, the wars that happened with Russia were erupted only in the 19th century, and those defeats are like one after the other in a very, and that seems to be more of an exception than the rule. So even if we say that history,
How many wars?
all the wars that happened at the end of the 19th century between Russia,
No, the wars, I mean, started much earlier than that. At least you have 3 centuries of wars.
with Russia?
Yeah.
No, I'm talking about the defeats that took place. Well, the wars with the Europeans, I mean, there were so many wars that it was, you know, it wasn't just Russians that were fighting the Ottomans, but the defeats that really create the syndrome of the Russian enemy. They weren't they only like at the end of the 19th century. That seems to be an exception. So, I mean, and Saudi Arabia isn't in the analysis. I mean, what do we say about Saudi Arabia's role? I mean, that seems to be a relevant issue. So I don't know. I mean, I guess my question
No,
is
no,
this.
good comments. Yeah.
Um,
I mean,
And we want to add Iran also. Iran as historically speaking, as now, which is more ideologically oriented than just simply ambitious nationalist.
One more question. Yes.
From your speech, if I understood it correct, you said that this idea of making an alliance with Russia is not a good idea because it
no, I said not sustainable in the long
yes,
run.
because it's not
Yeah.
sustainable. It may not be long term. And you said there is 2 options for Turkey. One is to rely on itself, and the second one is to look for some other alliances,
Yeah.
right? And I wanted to ask, what may be the options for these other alliances? Because as I think of some options, the things that may be options are immediate, like they can't be helping.
Okay, I got the question. Yeah, I mean, Tillerson is, to my surprise, you know, he is a very good diplomat. So he fulfills a very important task in this current mess in the United States created by Trump, because the State Department still many positions are vacant. You know, Trump is totally incapable of being a president, and that's very well known in the United States. So one of the mistakes that Turkish government has about Trump, they exaggerated Trump's you know, position and importance. And constitutionally speaking, United States president is not very important. I mean, it's a very important position, but not omnipotent position, not a very strong position because of checks and balances, etc. This message is interesting because, as you point out, it is directing to the Turkish people, not the government. So there is a message in that. There is also an implicit threat in the message that if you move strategically, you will face, you know, important repercussions, economically speaking, or I think economy is one, politically speaking as well. So it is quite an interesting message. Now, you can read that way, but you can also look at your own facts of the matter and make your own analysis and calculation, which my you know, thinking seems to be that Turkey does not have the same advantages in the alliance with Russia that it has in the deepening of relations with Europe and the United States from that perspective. Well, the importance of the United States, the power of the United States also seems to be seen in Turkey. Yes, there is a declining power of the United States, but still everybody has smartphones these days, and these smartphones are empowered by, controlled by a US-made operating system. Yes, the hard body of the phone is produced in China, but the software is produced in the United States, and there is no alternative power in the world today that can balance the United States in terms of technology. especially the computers. And so universities is another thing. So you know, for Turkey, the reliance on U.S. education is still very important, especially in the technical side. So you cannot balance these. I mean, for example, in our university, all of these engineering faculty members have PhDs from the United States. And yes, you can send them to Europe, but possibly, I mean, it's very difficult to integrate them if they have PhDs in Russia. And you know, so this, what I'm saying, you know, I mean, isolation from the United States is very, very hard for Turkey, educational speaking, technology-wise, but political separation is quite possible. I mean, the strategic separation is quite possible. And another thing, even though Turkey and the United States are two members of NATO, and that's an alliance, right, by definition, itself, Turkey and the United States are not strategic allies, but rather strategic partners. Historically speaking, this is not defined as an alliance, but rather as a strategic partnership. And it is also against the national identity of the United States to entangle itself too much in the alliances in the world because of the shifting alliances that they can also have. NATO is an exception in that sense for the United States as well, because don't forget that there was an enormous opposition within the United States against NATO because it's institutionalizing a foreign policy position which may change. I mean, why are you institutionalizing your own position? You know, so now Trump, actually, I criticize Trump, but Trump and Kissinger, basically, the brain behind Trump is Kissinger, is thinking that, you know, you have to move to the Pacific Ocean and leave the Atlantic region to Europe and Russia. That's the Kissinger's idea, because China and North Korea problem is much more dominant. And the United States cannot be everywhere because of its declining economic power, etc. Who are concerned about this withdrawal of the United States? Saudi Arabia is very much concerned because of the rise of Iran. Israel is very much concerned because of the rise of Iran, etc., and its own security. Germany is extremely concerned. For the first time, you see that Germany is diverting itself from the position of the United States. Where you see this? In Qatar. Nobody is talking now. Because of the tension between Turkey and Germany, Germany pursued about Qatar the same foreign policy position as Turkey, without coordinating this position. And at that time I said, you know, Turkey is losing an opportunity here. Because Turkish and German positions are actually similar. So one of the possible, for example, allies for Turkey, independent of the European integration, if the full membership is not coming, to see Germany as a strategic ally. If it is possible, I mean, you know, the question about the new allies. China can be another one. But the United States, I don't think in the long run, the United States will remain in this region. Because it's very expensive to remain in this region. By the way, all of the time you see in Syria, the bombings by Russia, right? I don't have the figure, but it's quite interesting. The expenditure of the United States in Syria is 3 times more than Russia. It's a tremendous expenditure. So how can you carry this burden? You cannot carry this burden forever. So United States is leaving the region, but the countries that are still in the region and cannot change the position in the region, because the United States is, the presence of the United States is temporary. They can leave because it's not their natural home. It's only in the region by its military presence, and they can withdraw. But Germany cannot do that. Germany will stay in this region, and Russia will remain as an important headache for Germany to balance against. Turkey will stay in this region, and Russia, and that's my disagreement with you, will continue to remain for Turkey as an important strategic competitor. Whether you want to make peace with them or not, it is against the historically rooted culture of security between the two countries. And I will give you one example. Mladic decision. Mladic was sentenced to life term, right? Life sentence. Which country protested against this? It's Russia. They harshly protested against this. Another example. Last year they held a military exercise in the Balkans and their allies were basically Serbians, because Greece cannot participate in that. And the name of this military exercise was Slavic Brotherhood. So when you say there is a rupture in Russian history, I myself do not believe in that rupture. 1917, there's the Slavic nationalism, resurgence of Slavic nationalism. And many people, I'm not a Sovietolog, but many Sovietologs see this continuity between the Soviet foreign policy and the Russian Tsar era foreign policy. And certainly, if the Soviets introduced this notion of communist brotherhood, Putin is replacing that with the Slavic brotherhood. And Slavic brotherhood is a continuation of not Soviet era, but the Russian Orthodox Tsar era. So I mean, I'm not ideologically anti-Russian, but I see a lot of historically rooted contradictions and contrasts between Turkey and Russia, which would, in my opinion, impede the chances of a strategic alliance between Turkey and Russia. That's simply not possible in my mind. And for the last question, and I said partly the answer may be Germany. It may be difficult as well. But another possibility is like Sultan Abdulhamid's search for an ally in Asia. In the case of Japan, because of the distance, it couldn't be materialized upon. Similar to that is China. If United States moves closer to another thing, by the way, I didn't highlight this. The possibility of the United States moving closer to Russia. They have more to offer to Russia than Turkey does. They can lure Russia against Turkey. I mean, have you ever thought about this? We think that United States and Russia will remain forever as enemies, and we can benefit from this. Their relationship, especially in Syria, their coordination. We do not have the full details of their, if there is a new Sykes-Picot, for example, between the United States and Russia. How do we, I mean, we think that, by moving closer to Russia, we are not safe. Well, the United States can come to Russia and do more and offer more to Russia, to the table. And those things, with this anger that Tillerson reflects in this message, may be very, very negative for Turkey. So, I mean, the world is changing, and I'm not very sure if Turkey is adjusting to these changes very, rationally.
Thank you very much, Professor Kösebalaban, for this informative and stimulating talk and conversation. And thank you very much, Professor Sarharian, for being discussed, and thank you very much for attending. Now we will present a plate.
This is a small parting gift.
Oh, no, it's very good. Thank you. Thank you very much. I wish the best for you and continuation of these intellectual exchanges.